Madam President, Your Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen and friends, welcome to this first opening session where we'll be touching on the subject of social cohesiveness. We seem to be living in an age of disruption. We seem to be living in a time of great uncertainty, violence, and chaos. This is easily detectable by anyone who has access to Netflix or HBO. It seems that over the last few years, whenever there's a new series on TV, inevitably it involves zombies or the apocalypse. There is even a movie about Jane Austen and zombies, I kid you not, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. We get the impression that the world is about to end. And yet the historian would interject at this point and ask a simple question. When in human history have we human beings not thought that the world is about to end? It goes all the way back to the fall of the Roman Empire. Read your Plato. There you find a grumpy Socrates lamenting the decline of values in Athenian society, especially the young. These young Athenians don't respect authority, don't respect tradition, wasting their time on poetry and music, which was, I suppose, the social media of the time. It's actually very rare that radical newness comes into the world. It's very rare. And all these factors, these external variable factors, centrifugal forces, parochialism, in-group, out-group thinking have always been with us. They've always been with us. Perhaps the one important difference that we see today in recent times, of course, are the technologies, the communicative architecture, the mediatic infrastructure that we see today that has brought with it these multiplier effects. So as Madam President pointed out earlier, fears, conspiracy theories spread faster today than ever. But this has nothing to do with a human inclination to see the world in negative terms. It's just that the technologies are accelerating it, perhaps beyond the control of states. So cohesiveness, is an important topic, and that's the theme of this opening session. How are societies cohesive? Now, there's cohesiveness and there's cohesiveness. A car is a cohesive object. As a car barrels down the road, it has to be a cohesive object. I hope it is. Its parts have to be welded together, riveted together. Otherwise, it would just fall apart. But flocks of birds and schools of fish also move cohesively. But the fish are not glued to one another. The birds are not riveted to one another. And I would argue that human society has more in similarity to that. We are, as Madam President pointed out earlier, human beings living in our human society, human-made societies with our norms. The challenge that faces so many societies and states today is, how do we, on the one hand, cherish, promote, even encourage the complexity and the diversity that exists naturally among human beings in all human societies, while at the same time, be wary of these centrifugal forces that can actually rip societies apart. Now, to that end, for this session, we have two very eminent speakers. To my immediate left, friend and colleague, Professor Lily Kong from the Singapore Management University, who is well known to all of us here in Singapore for her work, particularly in the study of religion. Further to my left, my new friend, Professor Katherine Marshall, Senior Fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, with a long career in the World Bank, and who is also one of the founders of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, an NGO that encourages work between different faith communities. Now, the combined wealth of experience and knowledge of our two eminent speakers, I think, is something that will enrich our panel. And so without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Lily to address all of us on the subject of social cohesion.
Thank you. I'll just take the rostrum. A very good morning, President Halimah, friends and colleagues. It's delightful to be able to be here in person with so many of you. As Farish says, I am a scholar of religion. Actually, I'm a social and cultural geographer, and I have studied cities in Asia for a long time, particularly Singapore, and I have been interested in intercommunal relationships for a very long time. I suppose the reason why I was invited to address you this morning was because my work has for a long time focused on religion, and in particular inter-religious relations and state-religion relations. However, I will not focus only on that dimension today, because as we think about social cohesion, certainly in the context of Singapore, it has become, I think, a whole lot more complex. Well, it's always been complex, but the complexity, as Farish says, has come to the fore, perhaps because of certain conditions in today's society and polity. So what I'm going to do is to begin by reminding ourselves, or asking ourselves rather, when we say social cohesion, what do we mean? And then in the context of Singapore at least, what are those factors or conditions that could be fault lines in, sort of standing in the way of a socially cohesive society. Social cohesion is a very multiplicitous concept, and if you look in the academic literature, there is a lot of discussion about what it actually means and whether or not it's rather too slippery and rather too vague, and it encompasses rather too much. I suppose if you take a look at the literatures, the bulk of the discussion would center around the following ideas: that social cohesion entails an enduring sense of trust, a strong sense of community, a sense of shared loyalties, a sense of solidarity, and more. And some of these concepts go back a long, long way. So if you think about solidarity, for example, we go back to the sociologist Durkheim, who talks about mechanical solidarity, organic solidarity, and this is not the time for me to go into a parsing of what concepts mean, but very broadly, that sense of social cohesion that encompasses these different dimensions. Now, there are many different frameworks, and you've already heard President Halimah talk about a study that's to be launched this afternoon by RSIS, a very valuable piece of work that seeks to understand social cohesion in Southeast Asia. And that social cohesion in Southeast Asia, the radar that they have developed, is based very much on this particular social cohesion framework, Bertelsmann Stiftung's social cohesion framework. And I won't go into chapter and verse here, but you will see that there are three key dimensions of social relations, by which they mean cohesion through a network of relationships, horizontal relationships between people, between individuals, and between groups of different kinds. The second element of that is connectedness, that promotes cohesion through positive identification with the country, a high level of confidence in its institutions, and a perception that social conditions are fair. A perception that social conditions are fair. And a third dimension, which is that a socially cohesive society is one where its elements, its parts, are able to focus on the common good. Right? So this is one of a multiplicity of frameworks that are out there, but it is one that has value enough for RSIS to pick this up and to adopt this as the basis for a study that they have undertaken which you will hear more about this afternoon. But I draw it to your attention because it's the first study of all 10 ASEAN states based on primary data. It seeks to understand the level of cohesion in different Southeast Asian countries, and its hope and goal is to identify ways in which social cohesion is enhanced so that stakeholder groups can actually take action based on the study to consider actions that can enhance social cohesion. So an action-oriented study that hopefully will be helpful to Southeast Asian countries. Now, I lay this background about the Southeast Asian work, but want to return to Singapore in particular. I asked the question, why is this question about social cohesion more important now than in the past? As Farish said, from a historian's perspective, look through history, through the centuries, social cohesion and the fault lines in societies have always been there. But I would suggest that in this day and time, it is perhaps more important now than in the past because of the conditions that we face today, because the historical moment is such that with globalization and increased mobility and migration, there are more fault lines that have emerged. And in the face of globalization are pressures for deglobalization, and so those forces are pressing on one another. The more diverse societies, because travel and movement and mobility is much more possible today than in the past. COVID as hopefully a blip in our human history. And so the complexity of challenges that arise from all of that, including the crisis of a generation, COVID-19 with the economic crisis that have ensued, the geopolitical complexities and so forth. And so more than ever, there is a critical need to build social cohesion and the resilience that accompanies that. And that resilience is so important because as societies confront the challenges that we all face today, we need to learn to cope with the stresses and the disturbances that arise from social, political, economic, and environmental challenges. And to not just be able to cope with them, but to also recover from adversities without societies splintering. In the context of Singapore, we're not immune to any of that. In fact, some might suggest that as a small nation state, a city state, we are somewhat still more vulnerable to that. Some of the key fault lines that you see in Singapore. Now, for a very long time, Singapore has focused its attention on race and religion as fault lines. Indeed, the very focus of this conference, very much on religion, although not exclusively on it, but very much focused on religion, suggests this continued sense of urgency around building cohesive societies that bring religious groups together in a harmonious society. And those remain absolutely important. But I also want to zoom out, right? It's possible to zoom in and talk about interreligious relations and indeed intra-religious relations, which I will do in a moment, but it's as important to zoom out and remind ourselves that race and religion is, in a complex way, interweaved with other social conditions and social factors. And so growing migration and the multiculturalism that was there already, but is now much more complex, that impinges on race and religion, which I will again talk about in a moment, inequalities, social class, economic class inequalities and inequities that may intersect with race and religion in some societies. The bifurcation of those who are digitally savvy and live in a technological world, and those who don't, the virtual and the physical. And for those who do live in a virtual world, the divides in a virtual world also impinge on social cohesion. And not to forget that as an aging society in Singapore, the intergenerational relationships are quite as important in building a cohesive society. So the intergeneration ethno inclusiveness, or the lack thereof, is something that we need to also pay attention to. Now, you'll notice that I've actually not included language here. In days gone by, historically in Singapore, language was, I think, quite a divisive factor as well. I certainly remember a time when Chinese dialects were spoken in multiplicities, and the different dialect groups within the Chinese community were at loggerheads with one another. This is, during the colonial era. The use of Mandarin as a binding force, a Speak Mandarin campaign that has tried to bring the Chinese community together, the use of English as a lingua franca. So to a very large extent, it is my belief that language has been bridged as a dividing force, although new cleavages are forming, which I will say a little bit more later. I have about 10 minutes left, so I shall speed up. I will say something about cultivating and managing social cohesion in Singapore before I dive into each of those fault lines that I've talked about. In the context of a city-state that is small, vulnerable, open to the world, social cohesion has not been left to fate and chance. There has been a lot of effort put into building that socially cohesive society, and a lot of it is state-led. And I would say that that is predominant, and there are many instruments that have been in use: legal instruments, policy instruments, regulatory instruments, but also very important discursive instruments, public suasion. There are community-led efforts, and increasingly, I think that is going to have to be more important, and you've heard our President, Halima, speak a little bit about that. And they are sometimes organic efforts that just emerge, but sometimes also very organized community efforts. In what I will say in each of the areas of potential fault lines or real fault lines, I will also say something about the efforts to address social cohesion. Singapore is a multi-racial and multi-religious society, but a secular state. For the Singaporeans amongst you, you are well familiar with this. For those of you who study Singapore but who are not based in Singapore, you may well be familiar with this as well. And I suspect this is a majority in the room, so I'm not going to go into chapter and verse about how, what the profile of race and religion is in Singapore. Happy to speak about it if there are questions. But even while we are used to a CMIO category, Chinese, Malay, Indian, or others, there is increasing complexity. There is what is called super diversity, an increasing super diversity, so that even within the Chinese, where it used to be, the Cantonese and the Teochews and the Hokkiens, and that's been sort of somewhat moderated through the use of Mandarin as a lingua franca, the fact of the matter is that we now have migrants from elsewhere who are Chinese ethnically, but from different contexts, backgrounds, historical conditions, that now add a different layer of complexity and diversity, or super diversity, even within the Chinese population. And the same is true with the Indian population and elsewhere, not to mention other ethnicities and nationalities that are not reflected in our ethnic mix right now. So the increasing super diversity has led to new racial and religious pluralisms. And I have just completed a research project with a colleague of mine at Singapore Management University that focuses on these new religious pluralisms. In a couple of weeks, we're running a workshop. Some of you who are based in Singapore have been invited to that. And we will actually dive a lot more in that session into how these new pluralisms need concerted attention. Right now, the old categories are actually contestable because of these new super diversities, and indeed are contested. And so the intra-racial and the intra-religious diversities deserve attention in the same way that we have always been paying attention to the interracial and the interreligious. So one of the things that we found in our study, for example, is when new migrants enter into religious institutions, what integration is happening with the Singapore population? Is religion then a force for building cohesive groups within the religion, or are these different communities, migrant communities, divided from a Singapore-based community or a Singaporean community? And that is a potential new fault line that can become quite serious, which we need to pay attention to. Now, as I've said, a lot of our instruments, as you will see on this next slide, are tied to inter-religious, not intra-religious, to interracial, not necessarily intraracial. So there are well-established approaches to interracial, interreligious relations management in the context of Singapore. There are legal instruments like the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, right? I won't have time to go into chapter and verse again, but I cite these examples and happy to elaborate on any of them during the dialogue later. The Broadcast Act, which one may not ordinarily think of as, impinging on or influencing interracial and interreligious relations, is another one that actually, has detailed codes of conduct about what is acceptable or not in the public domain through radio, TV, and those traditional forms of media. And those are ways in which we can manage interreligious, interracial relations by circumscribing what can be said, what can't be said, or how things can be said. There are policy instruments. The ethnic housing policy is a key one, where there is an attempt to ensure that in every housing estate, different different racial groups or different ethnic groups are mixed together. There is public suasion, religion in public discourse by political leaders, for example, are articulated as an agent of progress and development for the country and as a promoter of communitarian values, right? So these are all different ways in which, in the context of Singapore, efforts are made to build a more cohesive society based on race and religious harmony. Intra-racial and intra-religious relations are much more taken for granted, but are actually, as I've said, much more subtle and complex. There aren't the frameworks and guidelines from above in the same way that we have with interracial and interreligious. In fact, I would suggest that in some religious institutions, the segregation actually is practiced not by design, but as a way of actually trying to bring new communities into the religious institution and to the religion. And the best way to do it is to keep the people, the migrants, in communities that they're comfortable with, but not necessarily with others, in Singapore, for example. So integration is not yet, I think, very deliberately on the agenda, and converting rather than converging, converting rather than converging is a primary focus. If you take a look at migration, in a sense, I've already spoken about it within the context of race and religion. The fact that migration brings in perhaps about 1/3 of Singapore's resident population. 1 in 3 marriages registered in Singapore are cross-national, may also be cross-ethnic. 1 in 5 Singapore households depend on a live-in foreign domestic worker. So what you have is a much more diverse society and economy at all levels. And it's not just about bringing people in, it's also 6 in every 100 Singaporeans reside abroad. And so there are challenges to social cohesion that we must be cognizant of and work on. The xenophobia that can emerge, the NIMBYism, the us versus them mentality, which can stem from a perception of greater crowding, of greater job competition, for greater competition for opportunities like education, the formation of enclaves, physical enclaves, residential enclaves, language and cultural differences. So where I said language had become somewhat of a lesser issue or even a non-issue at one point in time, with successful language policies, the influx of new migrants with new languages, adds another complexity that needs to be addressed. I won't have time to go into all of it because I have already exceeded my time, but I have some ideas about how we might address, or not some ideas, they're not my ideas, some insights into how Singapore has sought to address some of these issues. And they're not always about addressing the relationships themselves, but about addressing the largest societal, infrastructural, economic conditions. Because if there are improved infrastructures and facilities, people feel access to transport is easy, they're not crowded, etc. There's a vibrant economy with healthy employment rates, opportunities for Singaporeans in schools and jobs and so forth. There is much less of an opportunity to feel like somebody else is taking away my rice bowl, my comfort zone. I turn very quickly to a third area of inequality and inequity, and this is about income inequality, but also wealth inequality and reduced social mobility. That too impacts on social cohesion when a strata in society might feel like I am constantly the have-not, and however hard I work, whatever I choose to do, I'm unable to bridge that divide. And that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, where the bottom 20% of households have experienced the steepest wage decline. So an increasing stratification along class lines is something that we need to pay very careful attention to. And in a study by IPS, the Institute of Policy Studies in Singapore, in 2017, they suggested from the empirical evidence that the stratification along class lines might be more pronounced than along race and religion. Again, there are ways in which we can try and create more diverse networks through schools, through the workplace, through national service, through common interest associations, whether it's based on sports, arts, culture, heritage, etc. All of this helps to build social capital, helps to bolster trust, strengthen social cohesion, and can create the opportunity for upward mobility. Certainly, efforts in school is one. A fourth dimension is virtual and physical. The digital divides between the seniors and the younger generation, between the poor and those who are better endowed and better educated. We have what we might call the digital left behinds. Within the group that is digitally engaged, you could have digital tribes and echo chambers that reflect and reflect upon their views, their own views all the time, and reinforce their views. And this can be extremely divisive. They can get into comfort zones, reducing common spaces. There is a great opportunity for that divide to sink in, but there's also a great opportunity for us to actually address that as a society, because the digital penetration rate is extremely high. 50% of Singaporeans use social media to expand their social networks. How can we leverage on that? How might we have virtual communities around common causes? And there is something that is called SG Cares Digital Kampung, which again I won't have time to elaborate on, but these are sometimes organic, sometimes organized efforts from the community, and sometimes efforts by government-led agencies. A fifth and final disconnect could be intergenerational, and this can impact on social cohesion. With an aging population in Singapore, with an increase in single elder households, with an increase in working adults working overseas, many of the 6 in 100 Singaporeans who are overseas are the working adults, what you're finding is that there are intergenerational divisions that we should be mindful of, a potential of intergenerational segregation and ageism that can sink in with an aging society. And so a constant effort to pay attention to promoting intergenerational interactions and an age-integrated society. And again, there are different kinds of instruments, legal instruments, policy instruments, some of which you see on the screen. I won't go into chapter and verse right now. Suffice to say that while we have always, as a society, paid attention to race and religion as fault lines that could impact on building a socially cohesive society, the complexity of Singapore society today is such that there are so many other dimensions that impact on social cohesion, and the interconnections and interweaving of these different conditions, the 5 different areas, are not discrete. They interweave and they make for much more complex conversations and much more complex solutions that are needed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lily. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Katherine.
Good morning. I can't say what a pleasure it is to be back in Singapore. And my primary objective here is to learn from all of you. Singapore is much admired in the world that I come from, which is the world of international development, and most recently, trying to answer the difficult question, what does religion have to do with it? So I'm going to begin where the president began, talking about this particular moment in history as we emerge from this extraordinary, historic COVID crisis and COVID emergencies. It is what some call a polycrisis. Dr. Ong mentioned that term last night, but the multiple crises that confront different leaders. And so here, I'm going to read out a citation, which is, I think, the challenge facing all of us. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. This is from Arundhati Roy, writing actually not long after the pandemic began in the Financial Times, an unusual location, early in 2020. But I think that the challenge that we see before us is that this should be a kairos moment, a moment of grace and opportunity, a moment when we look backwards and when we look forward. And there are many opportunities. I focus particularly on the upcoming G20 summit in Indonesia in November. But there's also, of course, coming very soon, the General Assembly of the United Nations, the World Bank, Conference on Education, and so forth. So many opportunities to make sure that we do not face this crisis dragging old ideas behind, but take this as that opportunity to look afresh, to look anew at the world. I'm going to reflect on 6 topics briefly, very briefly. The first is looking at diversity as a feature of modernity and some of the changes. Secondly, reflecting on the religious dimensions of those crises. And then third, I'm going to look at 2 what I call buts, 2 of the complexities that we face, looking at it globally, looking at the dynamics of addressing these issues of social cohesion and the role of religion. And finally, looking ahead to framing some common avenues as we look ahead. So first, it is worth remembering always that the kind of diversity that we're speaking about today is very much a feature of the modern world. Through most of history, social peace was seen as depending on social homogeneity. And that includes the religious, ethnic, basically of ideas. That was true for most of human history. And the solution to diversity was, and still sometimes is, to coerce conformity and values and behavior. And today, that is simply not possible, and it also obviously counters our basic principles of understanding of human rights. But today, living together differs very much from the past. Another fact to remember about the past is that most people through history never moved more than 10 kilometers from where they were born. A wonderful story that I recall is a child born on London Bridge at the time that London Bridge was a town and never left London Bridge through his entire life. Obviously, we have a very different situation today. It's, I think, dangerous, even if it is tempting to look back romantically on the life of the past. But it is also worth remembering that lives were short. Most people were poor, most people were hungry. Those are the realities of the past. And I certainly come with the sense of the miracle reflected in the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, of an ideal and an idea where a world without poverty is possible, and because it is possible, it is before us. And that world is very clearly, that modern world, one of change, of dynamism, and one of diversity. It's also important to remember that it is likely to become much more pronounced in the future with migration, climate shifts, and increasingly complex identities for people. There are a series of articles coming out now that are trying to estimate what may happen with climate change. And the latest spate of articles is focusing on the fact that many parts of the world, the tropical world, the worlds not far from here, will become uninhabitable within a not very lengthy time frame. And the likelihood is of massive migrations, and therefore massive changes in the patterns of diversity. So this fact of living together in modern societies, largely urban societies, we've tipped into a majority urban, puts a whole new set of challenges to us. So where does the religious side of that come in? I come from a long career in the World Bank, where religion was very rarely mentioned. And when the president, Jim Wolfensohn, announced a new initiative to bridge the worlds of religion and development, the representatives of 184 countries almost universally opposed him because religion was seen as too political, too complex, and often opposed to the changes that are involved in development. That has changed over the past 25 to 30 years, though I would call it a partial change and one that has been quite jerky. In other words, countries have taken an interest in focusing on religion, but a new government comes in or a new leader comes in, and they have much less interest. There is a figure that is widely cited, I cite it often also, which is that some 84% of the world's population has some religious affiliation. Now, one of the things we know is that data about religion is really tough, very difficult to assess. So you have this 84% figure. What does it really mean? What are the complexities involved? But the basic point is that the old hypothesis that religion would become less important, the secularization thesis, is patently false. But it still leaves us with a question that I'm getting and that I put to all of you, for policymakers, when they're confronted with the importance of religion, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to respond to this religious diversity, and what's more, to a religious marketplace, which can be a fierce competitive marketplace through history, though there is an ideal reflected in a principle called covenantal pluralism, of a loving competition where all win, where there is a conscious effort to enhance religious literacy, cultural competence, and all of those issues. But when we look at this issue of diversity, it is interesting that there has been far more work and far more discussion about ethnic diversity, even class diversity, geographic diversity, et cetera, than there has been about the implications of religion. And the religious diversity can be very complex. I'm trying to track down the exact number, but 0.4% of India's population is represented by Jains. And one comment was that they have 15% of the wealth. I got the 0.4% of the population, but I don't have a figure on the wealth. But the point is that it is an enormously privileged, an enormously powerful group. And the positive roles of minorities in many situations are a feature of life and a complexity. On the other hand, we have many minorities that are discriminated against, and the evidence that we have through many different tracking exercises, looking at treatment of religious communities, religious minorities, both by states and by the societies, shows a worsening trend with very little explanation of why persecution and violence worldwide is getting worse. We look a lot at the distinctions between religious engagement, which is positive, which is reaching out, which is acknowledging the fundamentally integral role of religious communities within most societies, and then religious freedom, which takes us in a somewhat different direction. The meetings of the Alliance, looking for freedom of religion or belief in London, in early July, focused heavily on issues of minorities, and particularly persecuted minorities. They also came up against what has been, in my career, one of the most fundamental sets of questions, which is the roles of women and the ways in which women's rights, women's voice, women's roles in the religious context are seen as part of the diversity equation, if we can call it that. So another point that I think is important is that there is a lot of disagreement about the role of religion in conflict. Very different narratives. And to put it very simplistically or simply, one narrative is that religious conflict is a major cause of conflict worldwide. The other is that it really has nothing to do with religion, the conflict, that the conflicts are almost invariably linked to political leader manipulation. In other words, the critique of the political, which we hear so often. I mentioned two buts, two questions. The first one is that we know that diversity has enormous advantages, and we also can see that in relation to religion, that religious diversity enriches the society the same way as biodiversity, diversity of language, diversity of culture, diversity of food, of music, of everything else. So there are proven advantages of human diversity, cultural, etc. But we also know that those are often long-term benefits. And the short-term features of diversity can be quite complex, and they can result in tension. So I think that is the first but to remember. The second, I'm very conscious of because it is so extreme in the United States context, is the difference, someone said, is the most important insight of social science between the ideal and the actual. So the ideal is the way you would like it to be, but also very often the way you think it will be, whereas the actual is the reality. So in the United States, the ideal and what people think is the case is an intense diversity the melting pot, the acceptance of one and all. Bring me your poor, bring me everyone. And yet you have a society that is deeply polarized and deeply divided, often around issues of diversity precisely. The clock is running down, so I am going to comment very briefly on my last 2 points. The first one, which I think echoes very much of what Lily was talking about, is that managing diversity is very difficult. It's different in every situation, needs to be adapted, and it needs constant effort, because we have seen all too often that diversity can go haywire quite quickly. We've seen that during the COVID crisis, where there have been far too many cases of discrimination, of seeking to blame people who are different. So the religious nationalism, the growth of religious nationalism in many parts of the world is a frightening and a very worrying sign that this dynamic, this political leadership, but social leadership, civil society leadership, youth leadership, is a vital factor for the future. And the final set of points turn around what are some of the promising examples. And clearly, that's in many ways why we're here in Singapore, is because Singapore stands out as an extraordinary case. I remember one of the first reports that I read in my professional career was essentially about how Singapore was hopeless, that there was no way that it could be anything but a basket case with no resources, history of tensions, inequalities, etc. And yet Singapore now stands out as a world-class example. So the promising areas, I think we must focus, and Lily mentioned it, but I think we should come back to it constantly, is education. Another area is housing, and sports as a major area. I've spent many years, and Andre Azoulay was part of this at the Fez Festival of Global Sacred Music, which used the world's sacred music to inspire a dialogue process that encouraged people to go outside of their traditional beliefs and their institutional affiliations to look to new solutions. So the arts are clearly a vital area. And I think above all, we need a robust approach on religious engagement that goes well beyond tolerance to respect and to caring. And we need, obviously, to fight tribalism, the social media, the hate speech that we're seeing so often, and the human tendency to otherize, to define, we need to link what's called the bonding factors with the bridging culture of moving across. And finally, I'll come back to where I began, that I see this as a rare moment in human history, a kairos moment, when we can and when we must avoid the temptation to muddle back to where we were, but to look creatively and thoughtfully to a different and a much better future that exemplifies the potential that we see in the diversity here in this room and in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine. As we prepare for the discussions, and the questions are coming in, and please do submit your questions, allow me to start off with perhaps a general question to both of you, since both of you have touched on cohesiveness, diversity, difference, and otherness. I want to talk about the dread of the we. And the we, us, the idea of us being members of a common society, common humanity, on the surface of it, seems innocent, attractive even, and yet has become deeply problematic of late. And a good example would be what happened just 2 years ago with the advent of COVID, and how different societies in different parts of the world dealt with what had to be done. Those of us who were living in Asia were very familiar with this, yeah? The way in which the international media depicted some Southeast Asian and East Asian societies as being somehow conformist, because, you know, and as a historian, all these Orientalist cliches suddenly, you know, came out of the grave like zombies again. Of course they'll wear masks because they're conformists. Historically, they've had no sense of individualism or what have you. It's as if being part of a collective, being part of a we, has become somehow negative because it's immediately then associated with authoritarianism, conformity, and what have you. But this for me is absurd, because right now we are conforming, we're speaking the same language, otherwise we can't communicate. Many of the things that are enabling, many of the things that are positive, are things that we learn collectively in society. We learn friendship, we learn empathy, we learn to demonstrate our love. If someone walks down the street with a hammer, knocks someone on the head, and afterwards you ask him, why did you do that? I say, oh, I'm showing him how I love him. Sorry, that's not how you show love. There are ways that you show love. We learn it in society. So when we talk about cohesiveness, how do we overcome this? Because this seems to be a problem, a kind of dilemma that has emerged of late, living as we do in this age of, you know, super individualism, me of social media and what have you. How do we bridge this? How do we bridge this? How do we bring back, you know, positivity to the idea that being part of a collective is actually something, you know, that should be lauded and seen as responsible and good? How do we do that? Lily or Catherine?
Why don't you start off?
So it's, you know, I've lived in the UK for a few years in my earlier years, but the rest of the time I've lived in Singapore. I work and I travel a great deal and I observe, but I am born and bred Singaporean. And so to that background, I find it challenging to consider why the notion of a we should be problematic or exclusive from a me. To the extent that any society wants to cultivate creativity, critical thinking, independent thought, etc., the me seems to be an important part of that. But I would argue that actually for a society to be creative, to be, you know, all the things that I mentioned earlier, the we is quite as important. So if we're thinking about developing a sense of an identity for a country, a people, which I think, you know, precious few places would argue against, then it's as important to cultivate the me as well as the we to achieve that end. I don't think it's, I think it's problematic to say that a collection of me's will make for a nation. I think that if people feel that the sense of a nation, a collective is no longer important, then perhaps that's a direction to go. But I cannot conceive of any place that would say everybody's just an individual, we don't need a sense of collective, because human beings at the end of the day are gregarious people, are gregarious beings. Human beings at the end of the day need to feel like you belong to a group larger than yourself, a cause larger than yourself. There can be different groups in society, there can be different causes in society, but to imagine a society in which individuals believe in just a me approach is just a non-starter for me.
I think it's interesting to look at some of the metaphors that people have used for the COVID crisis. One of the first, unfortunately, I think, is military, that we're fighting a war against a virus. But I think the common humanity, we're all of it, us in the same boat, has been one repeatedly used, and yet it's quickly qualified that we're not all in the same boat. Even if we're in the same boat, we're in different parts of the boat, but more people are in yachts, but others are in tiny craft or clinging to driftwood and to life rafts. And I think that that has been one of the lessons of the COVID crisis, that you do need to adapt your messages. The messages of social distancing, staying at home, clearly had no applicability and no resonance with people who had to leave their homes in order to feed their families, and who lived in crowded places, who had no option for. So I think looking at these different experiences can help us to overcome the puzzlement that people have about the gap between the ideal of common humanity. This shows us that we're all really facing the same challenges, and yet people responded so very differently. So there are, again, a lot of lessons that we can learn from this COVID crisis.
Picking on that point, we've got a couple of questions here that deal with precisely this. Katherine, you talked about the othering, right? And I think this is also part of the paradox of the we. In the process of coming together, invariably, in many instances, societies also need another so that he knows what it is. You've both touched on diversity. Diversity is a fact of life. It's been around. You talked about ecosystems as well that are diverse. And yet today, societies that have historically been diverse for centuries suddenly find it problematic. And this is always an interesting question for historians. How is it and why is it that societies can live with complexity for so long, and then suddenly, overnight, an other is invented? You're no longer one of us, but you are an external other that has to be either expelled or suppressed or what have you. And this is related to some of the questions that have come in so far. To talk about this on a global level, how and why is this happening?
I think it is one of the great puzzles that people have seen societies where there has been seeming harmony and peace, and all of a sudden there is an explosion. And the factors involved are almost always different. They clearly relate to fear. This question of security seems to be a far more important question than people have often recognized, that when people are afraid, their instincts change. Clearly, the visibility of social media is a factor, and I think the visibility of inequality, the visibility of corruption, the visibility of some of these issues which have been there seem to perhaps to offer a partial explanation to what I think really is a puzzle that you hear in parts of the world all over. People just saying, I simply don't understand how societies that intermarried, that live together, you hear this in Nigeria, you hear this in so many other places, people went to school together, knew each other, and then all of a sudden, there's this click, and they find themselves in terrible, deadly conflict.
On that point, and going back to Lily, you talked about the digital divide as well. Both of you have touched on this. Yeah. When we look at how some societies today have become very fragile, very brittle, and the ease with which this sort of shift can happen, literally overnight, it's exacerbated and accelerated by the communicative architecture that we have today. Now, you've both touched on the digital divide. And even when it comes to hate campaigns, not everyone has equal access to the tools that can be used for such campaigns. So, is this an issue? And what can be done about this? Because two people have asked about this and to link it to the current realities of the world that we live in today. It's a global phenomenon. Lily?
Yeah. So I'll just go back to your previous question first and then come to this. I think, when is it that something turns and that divide, that hatred emerges? And I know that, that there are two responses to that. One is in terms of fulfillment of one's needs, and then the threat to that need. And I know that, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is sometimes quite vilified in certain circles, but having said that, I think there's something there that when one feels threatened, that your need is not going to be fulfilled, whether it's a personal, basic physiological need, or a need for shelter, a need for emotional security, etc., when that's threatened, that's when that sense of somebody is threatening it, that sense of I'm not going to be able to fulfill what I feel I need, that's when that hatred emerges. And that happens very often, and it's exacerbated today digitally, when in the digital world, you have hate speech that is amplified because it's an echo chamber, and those who say something find support amongst others of the same mind, etc. And the challenge is precisely that not everybody has access to the same communicative tools, as you say, so that those with a different perspective may well not be those who have access, or even if they had access, are not given to participation in these platforms. So just to cite an example where, if this digital divide coincides with that intergenerational difference that I was talking about earlier, that a younger cohort is very much digitally savvy, lives in the social media world, etc., and an older population does not, then the voices and the views that are being reinforced are the voice of a particular cohort, in this case, potentially the youth, and the voices that might be contrary are those of a different generation who feel differently about different values and approaches in life, but they're just not represented. So the digital divide, as with many of the other fault lines that I talk about, intersect with race and religion, intersect with class, intersect with age, and that's why the complexities are that much more exacerbated.
I think we need to distinguish always between sort of misinformation, the amplification of partial truths or whatever, but also the very deliberate conspiracy theories and misinformation. I was really quite stunned to hear from a colleague in Senegal that in rural Senegal, which is a long way away, people were so concerned by Bill Gates implanting chips with vaccine that you could no longer speak about vaccination. In other words, the spread and the speed of spread of some of this deliberate misinformation is extraordinary. I think there clearly is a lot of very interesting work being done to pin down, and it seems that it is a relatively small group of people who are responsible for some of the most malicious and dangerous anti-vaccination, for example, hate speech. But it is clearly a new world.
But on that note, though, I mean, though instances of miscommunication may emanate from a small group of people, I mean, what is enabling it now are the technologies that allow this misinformation to spread very fast. And that's being spread by ordinary people. Not necessarily maliciously, but out of habit, because again, we are social beings and we do what other people do. There are two questions here related to that and the media as well, and we've touched on the media. And when it comes to othering, how an issue is depicted, whether it's depicted as a challenge or a problem or a threat, I mean, that's something that's mediated. It's mediated through language, and the media plays an important role here. So two questions here about where's the media in all this? What role, has or should the media play when it comes to, again, talking about cohesiveness in society? Lily?
So I would say that, while we were talking about social media, etc., we're talking about the new media, but really the original virtual space, if I might put it that way, was radio and television, for example. And, I want to cite the example of how Singapore manages that, and I realized that from different perspectives that can be seen as somewhat authoritarian, a word that's been used already, but in other contexts, that has been pointed, some of these actions have been pointed to as what has led to Singapore being what it is, the ability to actually manage a very diverse sets of communities and to live in relative harmony. So I'll cite the example of how we have, say, through the statutes, the Broadcasting Act, for example. There are detailed codes of conduct, a radio program and advertising code, TV program, advertising and sponsorship code. And that's written into law as to, what kinds of behaviors are acceptable over the media. But it's also not just through law, it's a kind of institutionalized monitoring, advisory committees, ad hoc committees, and yes, censorship review committees, but also appeals committees that allow those who want to put out certain things that have been told, no, that's just touching on too sensitive issues, that's just going to be divisive for society. They have an avenue for appeals. So over the decades, building up this infrastructure, the social policy infrastructure and legal infrastructure that attempts to balance between that freedom of speech and that individual thought, vis-a-vis, building a common basis in society where civil dialogue can take place. These are some of the instruments that Singapore has used, and some will laud it and others will criticize it.
Okay. Now, we are about to end, but I really want to cram in two questions here. So can I address these questions to both of you separately? Here's an interesting question. How do we engage with youth whose confidence and identities revolve around social engagement and interests outside their ethnicity or outside their religion? I think this is an interesting question from a young student. Katherine, perhaps?
Can you say that again? I didn't hear it.
How do we engage with youth whose confidence and identities revolve around their social engagement and interests rather than their ethnic or religious identity?
It's a good question, because I think we are constantly dealing with this challenge of multiple identities that are much less simple than they ever were in the past. Let me give you one example that came out. I think we have time for this. That is, Robert Putnam said that when he went to high school, that he knew the religious affiliation of every member of his class. And he still remembers who was Catholic and who was Methodist. But today, his children have no idea the religious affiliation. And he has an interesting explanation, which is that it has a lot to do with mating. That the prejudice of in religion marriage has basically broken down. So I think that the point there is that we are in a very dynamic age, and that trying to put people into baskets of a single, even if it's a woman or a man or an ethnic or a geographic or urban versus rural or whatever, no longer works, that everyone is part of this multiple identities.
I think on that note, right, when we look at social mapping in the past was a two-dimensional affair. You map out society like that. And again, today we are living in very complex societies. We need to do three-dimensional mapping now because there are these horizontal and vertical cleavages of all kinds. So no one is in one box. You have multiple boxes all the time. Okay, time for one last quick question for Lily. It's laudable that there is an emphasis on integration and cohesion in various individuals and groups in society, but where is the place for valid grievances and dissent?
So I'd be the first to say that that is absolutely critical, that there is space for actually talking about difference, divergences. Differences can be celebrated. Divergences, I use the word consciously, suggests that there are differences that are difficult to converge. And I think that we must always have that space for discussing difference, and there are. So for example, different efforts such as setting up a harmony in diversity gallery, right, which has been set up in Singapore that brings together an exhibit on different religions. There are school groups that are brought through them. There are discussion sessions that are held thereafter to allow young children and adolescents to actually be able to discuss these sorts of issues. Those are platforms that allow for discussion about difference. But divergence, where you have different voices that refuse to recognize that there is difference and let live, but who insist on a particular point of view, that I think is much more challenging, certainly for a context like Singapore, where if you don't like the predominance of a Chinese population here, you can't move to the next city because you have to be moving country, right? The fact that we are a city-state, a nation-state, suggests that I think some of these platforms for reconciling difference, for acknowledging difference without it splintering into divergence is still more critical here than perhaps in other places. So a place for difference is there and must continue to be there, and we must continue to create those platforms for difference to be aired, but not for divergence to sink in.
So on that note, we are literally about to end our time in 3, 2, 1. Professor Lily Kong and Professor Katherine Marshall, thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen. This brings us to the end of our first special session. Thank you for attending.